Hello, and welcome back to the Elevate Your Running podcast. I'm here this week with sports psychology coach Emily Saul. Hi, Emily. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for
I'm
having me.
so excited to have you here. We connected a few weeks ago, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. And Emily's here today to talk all about how to chunk up your fall race. I think primarily we're going to be talking about the marathon, but we'll see where the conversation goes today. And we had an incredible, 20-minute conversation before this episode, before we started recording. And I thought, oh, we should have recorded that because it was amazing. And I'm sure that it's all going to come back up
We'll get it
again
there.
in this episode. But I think it's really important as we go into fall race season that we have a strategy, we have a plan in place for what to do when we're out on the course and we're out there having maybe the time of our lives, maybe feeling nervous, maybe feeling anxious, maybe feeling all of those things at once. And Emily's going to help us with that plan. So that's going to be really exciting. What is new, Emily? What's been new over the last 6 months with you?
Life has actually been pretty predictable and wonderful. So I think we're still included in the last 6 months. In March this year, I did a rim to rim to rim hike in the Grand Canyon with a bunch of friends, and that was a really fun activity experience to have. Some really great training that went into that included some long running miles and lots of stairs and hills and rucking with a weight vest and things like that. So, and since then, I've just been really enjoying my practice with all the athletes out there running in the world, and enjoying my own movement practice. So, yeah, it's been great.
That's awesome. And Emily's based in Boston. She was on the Elevate Your Running podcast earlier in, I think it was in the spring, maybe late April, early May. And we talked through race week and what to do to set yourself up for success when all those feelings start to creep in. So definitely check out that episode if you haven't listened to it already, or hey, if you have listened to it, maybe listen to it again, because there's always so many good tidbits in these types of episodes where we go back and listen and we learn something new. So I want to kick off the episode with a very important question, which is, why is it important to chunk up a marathon?
Yeah. It's one of the, I think, most important and sometimes underrated skills that we can use when we're approaching running. Number one reason to break it down into those smaller pieces and chunk up the experience is really that we, just as human beings, understanding how our brains work, we're really not very good at multitasking and doing like many things at once. And so when we have a complex task in front of us, we need to experience it in more manageable pieces, really, in order to navigate exactly what we're trying to do. So that's one piece. Marathons are they're just an incredibly long period of time, a long distance, even for those really fast runners who are, closer to the 2 hour mark. 2 hours is still a very long time to occupy your mind. And so if you don't have some element of a plan for focus of your mind, your brain is really your thoughts are gonna go a bunch of different places, and oftentimes they're gonna go to unhelpful places because running marathons is a pretty uncomfortable thing to do, especially as you get closer to the end of the race. And the other reason really that chunking is so deeply important is that we are always navigating. There's a part of our brain that is always navigating the challenge that's in front of us. It is essentially assessing, how difficult is this? How much energy and effort is it going to require of me to successfully navigate through, as in survive, this challenge? And so it's estimating how hard that's going to be. And then our brain is also assessing what's my level of resource. So, what kind of skills and ability and energy do I have? And it's looking for the comparison between how hard is this going to be and what's my ability to rise to that challenge. And if there's an overlap between that degree of challenge and our resources, we typically get a rise response, as in our perception is this is a challenge that even if it's challenging, it's difficult for us, we can stretch and rise to it and still survive, overcome, and feel good about that. But when we're looking at something that is the scale of it is so big or it is so complex that it really outsizes our resources to be able to respond to it, then we actually get a protective or a defensive response. We will tend to back off in order to survive more effectively by not approaching that challenge. And so, again, if a marathon is both a large in scale and a complex kind of challenge, it then becomes much more beneficial for us to look at that in smaller pieces. So we can use our cognitive ability to focus our attention not on the marathon as a whole, but on very manageable pieces that when we look at that piece alone and our brain assesses that challenge relative to our resources, it looks at it and goes, cool, I can handle that. And we get more of that rise response. We get much more access to our fullest potential, because we're really getting then our brain is responding more from a place of openness and curiosity rather than from a place of fear and protection. And really everyone physiologically is going to run more to their potential when you're working with a nervous system that's open and curious rather than fearful and protective. So
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I love that you use the word curious because that has been a word I've been using with the athletes I'm coaching right now, especially not so much in like the race strategy, but more in the track workouts, in the
mhm.
speed workouts, in the
Yeah.
long tempo. So whatever is getting kind of their nervous system activated,
Yeah.
and talking about like being curious going into it rather than thinking maybe the worst or thinking some negative things about it or
Mhm.
about yourself. And I think it can be really powerful to keep that kind of open mindset.
Mhm.
What do you suggest to an athlete who says, but Emily, I am thinking about three chunks down the road. I'm thinking I'm running in like mile 4 and I'm already thinking about mile 20 in the
Mhm.
marathon distance.
Yeah.
What's your best advice for that athlete?
Well, what we're focused on then is really the skill of mindful attention, or you could call it focus. So if for example right now, if I asked you to bring your attention to your right hand, can you do that, Sarah? Can you focus on your right hand?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And so you might look at it in order to focus on it,
Yeah.
but you might also just bring your attention kind of to the sensation of your hand, whether you're holding it up or have it placed on something, and notice where it's like in contact. And so while you're doing that, notice how I'm now asking you to kind of pay attention to the fact that you're not paying attention to any other part of your body except your hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
And but I can then ask you to shift your attention to your left hand. Okay. And now, can you do that? Can you notice where that's
Yeah.
resting and what that feels like, either on the outside, or you might even be able to bring your attention to like kind of inside the sensation of whether your hand is, tired or tense or holding something or not.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can shift your attention to your right hand again.
Hmm.
Okay. And so that ability to regulate your attention, to choose where it goes, that's a skill.
Yeah.
And very much like we get better at running longer distances, we build endurance. That's a skill. We also can build specific muscle by doing sets and reps of particular exercises that build certain muscles. The more that we practice choosing our focus and guiding our attention there, and then even if our attention gets sort of drawn away, kind of pulled by something else, we just notice that it's gotten grabbed and we guide it back, right? So say we're in a really like in a crowded coffee shop. So there's lots of noise, there's lots of movement, there's lots of those things. And I asked you to do the same thing. Pay attention to your right hand, which is like resting on your leg. And so you might be able to do that. You could grab your attention and kind of shift it there to your hand. And then there's a clatter in the background. And so you like your you hear that and your mind goes to that. And then I go, okay, bring it back to your hand. And you just shift your attention back to your hand. And then you notice something else that moves. And so you look there and then, nope, let's bring it back to your hand. And
Mm-hmm.
that repetition of even when your attention goes somewhere else, having the skill, the practice, that sort of strength of muscle of guiding your attention back to where you choose it to be. That is by far one of the most impactful skills that any runner will ever have. Because if you are so influenced by what you're focused on and you are choosing helpful things to bring your attention to, it just makes everything feel a little bit more functional, a little bit more effective. And so for the person who is running in mile 4 and keeps thinking about mile 20, we want to be working on that skill of attention and focus to bring your attention back to mile 4. So one of the things that I would work on with someone is what tools we then want to use to help draw that attention to mile 4, and how we where we want that attention to rest. We sort of need a landing space for it, because we can't just say to ourselves, don't think about mile 20. Our brains don't work that way. Actually, they don't function in that context of not. You have to think of mile 20 in order to not think of mile 20. It's a lot easier to just, for example, it's a lot easier to bring your attention to your breath right here, right now. And there's some wonderful tools, as simple as noticing your breath and counting breaths, or noticing a particular sensation of your breath, or pairing a word that has some meaning to you with your breath, so that you're then resting your attention on your breath and that word or the meaning or the number as you're counting. And that can help hold your attention there, not grasp it and squeeze it to death, but hold it. That's why I call it like a resting spot, or a landing spot. And then by default, you are no longer thinking about mile 20. And I think a lot of the athletes that I work with have had a lot of success in being able to recognize simply the difference between a helpful thought and an unhelpful thought, or when I go there, that just doesn't feel as helpful as when I come here. And so it's less about trying to prevent yourself from ever thinking about mile 20 until you're actually at it, and more about just noticing when I start thinking about mile 20 any other time than when I'm actually there, and that doesn't feel helpful, then I know I don't need to stay there. I can, and I've got the skill, that muscle, to bring my attention to a more helpful landing spot. And so the chunking of a race is really just identifying what are some of these kind of smaller, manageable tasks. So we're navigating the challenge. And then we also want to help build landing spots within those chunks to be able to know how I keep returning to those, instead of going like, okay, I've chunked it and therefore like I'm going to be successful. But then you're like, okay, I'm in one of 7 chunks. Oh my gosh, how am I going to get to 7 if I feel like this at 1? And all of those kinds of things, because we can do the same unhelpful things no matter what we're doing.
We show up the same way in all ways.
Yes.
So how important, and when should an athlete start to practice the focus, the attention, and maybe chunking in the training cycle? I know
Um,
we're a few weeks out from Berlin, and
yeah.
hopefully this still resonates for those running early marathons.
Yeah, well, I think it's helpful for all runners always. Certainly, the more practice you have at certain skills and using particular tools in a training cycle, the easier it will be to implement those on race day. It doesn't mean that you can't learn new things and work on using them, even if we're in this time frame before Berlin and the rest of the fall marathons. Um, but I think as early as possible in a training cycle is always helpful. But this is where it's also just a good reminder that all of the things that we're working on are going to be helpful for all of the rest of our running.
Yeah.
So, always, right? Anything we
Yeah.
learn now is going to be infinitely useful. But if you think about the structure of a bunch of the pieces of typical training, we actually do almost by default. People find certain elements more. More easy, like more easily navigatable, because they are inherently organized in those smaller pieces. So I would say the intentional decision around, okay, how am I going to break this up so that I've got manageable challenge, and then what are my tools for my my attentional landing spots. That's a really great thing to be practicing in long runs as early on as you possibly can. And even if all you've got is one or two long runs left, start practicing now. Just like use it as an opportunity to explore it and experience what that's like. But workouts are a really good example of how they're naturally organized into those smaller chunks. Even if someone has some like longer tempo stuff, it's usually like one chunk and some recovery and then another. But a lot of our speed work has multiple, many intervals with rest or recovery in between. And so the people that I find have the hardest time with workouts are ones who not only get intimidated and tell themselves that it is a test and they have to perform and that they got to
Hmm.
prove something,
Hmm.
but also folks who look at the volume of work as one big thing. So
Hmm.
instead of looking at it as, okay, I'm doing, 2-minute intervals, or I'm doing 4-minute intervals, or 800s or 400, whatever the breakdown is. But if they add it all up and they're like, okay, 9 miles of speed work, right? Because they're including their warm up and their cool down and all of the stuff in between, and they're like lumping it all in, and they're building it up, and they're basically doing the opposite of what I suggested. They're making it feel like a much bigger thing, all at once. Um, and so then when they're trying to do even the smaller piece at this higher intensity, they keep thinking about how will I be able to do this for this bigger volume, and it just kind of overwhelms them. And there are other ways to kind of work your mind around it in a way that's quite unhelpful. But when someone is able to really approach each of those intervals or pieces of the workout as singular tasks, that it's
Hmm.
really not like, okay, one of 10, and so even if this feels okay, like it's going to feel hard later, that sort of thing. But I
Yeah.
really encourage people to be like, okay, do one and like start it and finish it. And then like acknowledge that you locked it in. It is complete, as in there is a success, a finality to that is done.
Hmm.
Congratulations. And then allowing yourself to use the recovery in between to really like unload that. Okay, that's over. I don't have to worry about it. Essentially, I'm asking people to like reduce the tallying of how many are yet to do and how many I've done. Of course, you have to keep track, but that doesn't have to be your prominent focus. And if
Yeah.
instead you're really able to be as present as you can for each of those pieces, that like this is the one and only thing that I'm doing. Not You're not lying to yourself like, and then I don't have to do anymore. But right now in this moment, this is the one and only thing that you are doing. It's the only thing that you can do in this moment. You can't
Yeah.
run your next interval right now. You have to run this one. And so by really embracing that sort of zooming in and bringing your focus to that very manageable piece and letting yourself experience it very much as a like as a singular task and challenge, um, we can feel a lot less of that sense of pressure, or that, like, this is done, but it doesn't count until I've done them all or done them all correctly, or that sort of thing. A lot of the values sort of feels like it's hanging in the balance, and there's only one point at the very end that I'll know whether I did a good job or I failed. And so we're by breaking it down a lot more, and just allowing yourself to sort of feel each of those pieces independently, it becomes much more helpful. So if we take what we learn from those formats of workouts and you just then look at, okay, if you've got an easy run and it's only 3 miles, maybe that doesn't need to be sort of chunked out, but
Yeah.
maybe that's an opportunity to really practice where you're bringing your focus to something and like continue to bring it back or work on some of those specific tools. But even if you're doing some like middle range miles, or you've got a couple of like bigger chunks of work, it's still a really good opportunity to like let your warm up be your warm up, and like don't think about how many miles that is. Just like label the warm up and how you want to feel in that warm up. And so I often, play with the warm up being like, do you want the words or the focus, that feel, the experience of it to be like steady and easy? Do you just want to think about warming up, getting ready? So I really ask people to sort of find what's the word or the feeling that they want to experience. And so you just focus on that in those miles, and then it's done. And you just like
Mhm.
let it almost like disappear, so that you're looking at this next piece, not with this sense of, but I've already done this and I have all this after. You just, okay, and so I'm doing this piece. And then when that gets done, you acknowledge, like, okay, that's done. Let it just kind of disappear. So again, we're really just navigating our reactivity and how we're framing and interpreting how challenging it is, and what we're telling ourselves about what it means if we do it well or not.
Yeah, I find it incredibly powerful. Chunked I chunk my daily runs, I chunk my workouts, I chunk my long runs, I chunk it all. And I literally, like, I visualize just like a check mark next to like the chunk once I complete it, and
Mhm.
I find it really helpful. What is your advice to someone, whether it's a workout, a long run, or a race, where maybe a chunk isn't going the way that you wanted it to go and things are starting to go sideways a little bit, whether the effort's feeling a lot harder than it should, or you feel like maybe you didn't execute it the way you wanted to execute it? What's kind of your advice for that runner?
You gave me a good example, and I still want to say it depends. It depends
That
on
is
the
the
runner.
answer in this industry for
No,
everyone and
I
everything. It's fine.
know. No, it really does depend on the runner. So this is where the use of this breadth of tools, what I focus on is these mental tools, that help us again kind of decide, where does our attention need to go, as in where is it going to be most helpful for me to focus. So if
Hmm.
I'm in one piece and I've told myself that success in this chunk of the race is running at this pace, and I'm not running at that pace, there's a bunch of different things that we can do sometimes, and this is where it would really depend on the person and kind of what's coming up for them, as well as some of the race specific context. But if there's good reason for that to happen, as in I'm running in this chunk and I've told myself I'm supposed to be at this pace and it's 80 degrees outside, well, guess what? You don't just get to be mad at yourself for not doing that and then start berating yourself, or force yourself to try, just suck it up and try to run faster, because the likelihood of getting that kind of outcome is very low. And
Hmm.
essentially you're just ignoring what are true factors that are actually influencing you, and you're overly attributing your ability to essentially be responsible or to be impervious to those factors. So that might be an issue where we're really focusing on how someone in that moment kind of takes what they've defined as success and puts that into context. So is this specific definition of success in this context, does that actually still make sense? And so there might be opportunity for that person, given that they have some capacity of mind, to 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 really redefine what success is in that moment, because that might be necessary and still very possible. um, there are other situations where there may just be something going on, something doesn't feel particularly great, maybe not hitting pace, and maybe there aren't weather or contextual environmental factors that are influencing that. And so then I would work with that person on trying to understand where their attention is. So what are they either thinking about, or what are they focused on? What's the sort of physical experience and sensation that's happening for them in that moment? Because sometimes people are focused in ways that in that moment is contributing to the the underperformance or the undesired performance. And we
Mhm.
can simply apply some tools that help them to shift their focus to another, what I call sort of another location, another landing spot that is just much more helpful for them. And the two kind of big categories that anyone who's worked with me hears me talk about all the time, but um, there's really an internal location. There's a lot of different tools and specific things that you can use in that internal space, but I call that tuning in. So you can
Mhm.
bring your attention to a tuned in location, and that's really anything that's like inside your body. So you might be focused on the mechanics of running, you might be focused on your breath, you might be focused on physical sensation that you've got. It might be focused on particular, like, words or meaning. Um, and not necessarily opposite, but the other big category is tuning out, and that's essentially bringing your attention outside of your physical self. So you might be focused on spectators and people around you, you might be focused on the actual people you're running with, if you're with a friend or in a group. You might be tuning out to, like, visualize being in a different location, like a location that you love, or a time that you felt really good in running. You might use like music or podcasts, or another, like listening to something, or other examples of tuning out. And what happens as I kind of name a bunch of those different like locations for your attention is that you can kind of sort through in your own experience. Oh yeah, when I tend to focus in, right, tune in to my like physical experience of running, sometimes that's really helpful, right? If I'm at the start of a race and I'm able to tune into like my breath and my level of effort and sort of what's happening in my body, I'm much more likely to start in a way and at a pace and an effort that works with my body. Okay.
Mhm.
However, at mile 20, if I'm really tuned in and focused on that physical sensation inside my body, I might be like, make it stop. I got to get out of here. So so tuning in is absolutely sometimes a very helpful tool and location for your attention, and sometimes it's not. Okay. Vice versa, like tuning out, I might be paying attention to those kind of sensations around me, or all of that kind of excitement and stimulation, the people, the sounds, the noise, the all of the kind of things that are happening. If I'm tuned out at the start of a race, I might very easily get overstimulated because I'm just taking in too much information from outside.
Mhm.
But if I'm at mile 20, a lot of people actually find a wonderful surge or boost of energy when they tune out of their own uncomfortable body and can rely on the cheers of a crowd, or just seeing that they're in a sea of people who are also moving toward a finish line, and sort of feeling that sense of like being a part of something bigger than themselves. And so I know I'm speaking very like broadly and like
Yeah.
with lots of different tools, but ultimately the what the practice really comes down to for people is recognizing in this moment, where is my attention? What am I focused on? And if it's not helpful to me, shift your focus to somewhere else. And it doesn't always mean, if you're tuned in, go tune out, or if you're
Hmm.
tuned out, go tune in. But those are really helpful categories for being able to go, if I tune out, does that help more? Is that any better if I than when I'm really tuned in? And so I work with people to then get really specific on which tune in kinds of tools are going to be most helpful for them, or which tune out tools are going to be most helpful for them at different parts of the race. And that becomes a big part of a part of the race planning, the mental race planning strategy.
Yeah, and that's huge. And that's like learning to know more about yourself and how you show up in training and running and racing. And I remember, and I've shared this story a lot on the podcast, like for the last mile of the Chicago Marathon, I was feeling good, probably better than I think most people feel, but I had started pretty conservative, which is why. And I remember seeing the crowd of people ahead of me take a right turn, and I knew that the finish line was right around that corner, and I was still maybe about a mile away or so. So I just focused on each runner turning that right turn,
Yep.
and I was completely I was like tuned out,
Yep.
and I ran the fastest mile out of the day. And it was incredible.
Yeah.
It was incredible. And it's like the power of tuning in, tuning out, knowing what works for you, knowing what doesn't,
Yeah.
um, is huge. And you can practice that in training. You can
Yeah.
journal it.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize like the verb there.
Yeah.
It's figuring out what works for you, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't always know. And I hope that anyone listening is like, but I don't know what those are. No one does initially, right?
Yeah.
How we come to eventually have a better sense of what tends to work for us is that we figure it out just
Yeah.
by trying it. And it's a lot like taste testing food. Right? You know how clearly and just simply when you put something in your mouth, you're like, I like that, or ooh, I don't like that. Like it's sort of that overt. A lot of the tools that we use in terms of where am I shifting my attention, we get a very pretty immediate response from our whole bodies, as in, I like that, that feels better, or no, I don't like that, I don't want to do that. Okay. And
Mhm.
so that's just for you in that moment.
Mhm.
That's more or less helpful. That's it. It doesn't mean it's a good tool or a bad tool. It doesn't mean I can never use this or I always use this. It means for right now, this helps. And so you use it until it's not helping anymore, and then you find a new tool to use. And so that's where practicing and using this in your training becomes so useful,
Yeah.
because you just have more opportunities to try these things out and do some of that figuring out, that like, oh yeah, so in my long runs, which are very similar to the
Mhm.
distance of races, increasingly so, you get to figure out how these tools feel at the beginning or in the middle or toward the end. And if there are, like, everyone does sort of come to understand that there are certain more like tried and true tools that like these generally tend to work for me in these kinds of situations. So that's where you're speaking to like
Yeah.
know what works for you. But you also get surprised by that. The I mentioned before the tool of counting breaths.
Mhm.
For me, that's something I use a lot. I talk with people a lot about. And I was a rower collegiately, and when we would do a lot of like long pieces on the erg, the rowing machine, I wasn't counting breaths. I was counting strokes because that's all you're doing is just taking stroke after stroke after stroke. But that for me, just in terms of figuring out, that was something that I discovered was very helpful for just holding my attention. If I'm counting, I have this sensation that I am making progress because the numbers are moving along. And I can sort of hold then less tightly to how long is it taking or how long has it been or how much is left. It's just if all I'm doing is counting to 100, 100 strokes, then I'm just getting to 100 and I don't have to think about anything else. I don't have to focus on anything until I get to 100. So it's just, it holds my attention there. And that's
Hmm.
kind of a wonderful thing to be able to do when you're feeling pretty uncomfortable. So I've translated that into my running by counting breaths. For me, that's the right sort of thing. I know some people prefer to count footsteps or cadence, one foot versus both. But there's all kinds of ways that we can again figure out how do I use this in a way that really does help me. There's someone I work with who has really enjoyed trying counting and you breath counting and uses that very frequently as a tool. But we've also discovered that there's a number. Initially, it was 20 was the number that she could count to, and she preferred to count up rather than counting down.
Hmm.
But having a number that was bigger than 20, so this is like again how we chunk things bigger than 20, like she started to sort of get outside of the thought. She would like her attention would go somewhere else about like how long it's going to be. So we stayed at 20 until she built that kind of skill and could really stay. She could really kind of rest her mind in that count of 20. And that's expanded. And not because bigger numbers are better, but it becomes more functional when you're doing longer pieces to not just count to 20 again and again. Um, but it's just this really beautiful process of figuring out for each person both what the tools are, when they seem to be more helpful for you, and then also how you build variety for them or build some specificity for them, really tailor them to yourself and the moment.
Yeah, I love that. And it's the beauty of the runner and growing as an athlete throughout the cycles, throughout the process, throughout the years of training and building on this skill set, which is so, so important. What is your advice for a runner who is going into their A goal marathon? They have a very specific, let's say, outcome goal,
Mhm.
and they still want to chunk the race. And there's this balance of staying focused on pace and staying focused in the chunk that they're in.
Mhm.
What's kind of your advice for that runner?
Um, I think I've said it before. I'm a big fan of having the goals that are really important to you. So
Hmm.
I don't encourage anyone to be like I cannot have a goal. So when you have an outcome based goal, it needs to be a part of your bigger mental race plan and a piece of what you focus on. But there's a lot of good a lot of good anecdotal and otherwise evidence that says if that's the only thing that you focus on, the likelihood that you're going
Hmm.
to feel more anxious, more fearful is very high. So
Hmm.
it really can't be the only thing that you focus on.
Hmm.
So I would tend to, again, I would explore this with the individual, sort of finding some of their, personal like preferences and figuring out how it would work for them. But I would really look at the pacing as just the bumpers on a bowling alley where
Yeah.
it's really just sort of this out on the edge, like it's the perimeter of what you're doing, but all within the middle, like the real action is in where is your attention that helps you to feel like you want to experience this race. So even if you want to feel strong and competitive, we still aren't going to laser focus ourselves on what's my pace, what's my pace, what's my
Yeah.
pace, right? If even if you want to feel something that's really in that competitive lane, like feeling strong and competitive, or powerful, or something like that. We're going to then look at what are the tools that are going to allow you to have that feeling, have that experience most effectively, because if that's how you want to feel, not that you can control kind of how the running feels for you, but your emotional
Mhm.
feel, your mental feel, you have a lot of control over. And so we're gonna focus on tools that help you to really leverage that experience that you're having. So when you're feeling that way, you are giving your body the most room to like do what it's capable of doing. And if you're trained for it and you give your body all of the space to do what it's capable of doing, like the time you get is what you're capable of. It may or may not perfectly match your intended pace and outcome time, but you're at least giving your physical body the best possible chance of being able to do that. So we really have to look at both of those things. How do you want to feel? What's your state of mind? What are you focused on when you actually feel most effective in your running? When you are, feel safest, most powerful, most competent, all of those things. And that does get specific to the person, but when you're focused on those actionable things that matter to you and that you are in control of, you're basically opening up the runway for your body to just like go do its thing. And then back to those bumpers, you have at the mile markers or at the 5K marks, you just go, okay, like, am I on pace? And if that's what you're trained for and your body's able to do it, you're probably going to be very close, if not on pace, as long as there aren't major external or environmental conditions that prevent that. And so you're just referencing the pace rather than focusing on the pace. And then you're focusing on the much more effective things for creating the right internal environment for that pace to happen.
Yeah, I love that advice. As someone who is pretty focused and on pace,
Mhm.
that helps me as an athlete. I know sometimes I can fall off pace and I can look down and think, oh no, I'm slower.
Yeah.
And that can happen. And it's good to know that at the end of the day, a lot of it is about trusting yourself and trusting your ability and knowing like you're ready to go, you're
Yeah.
ready to roll.
Yeah. I mean, we do a better job in the effort when you're actually working on running. We do a better job using the combination of information of the sensation of effort and the pace. So
Mm,
when I look at my watch and I see what pace I'm running, I don't effectively have control over the number that shows on the watch,
yeah.
right? But I do have a very strong influence over how I engage with that sensation of effort. So I don't, and I don't know if this makes sense to people, but like I don't know how to make a particular pace show up. But my body does know how to work a little harder, or how to
Mm,
relax, or how to back off, or how to find better rhythm. My body does understand those more kind of sensation effort based cues. And so even if I'm like, oh, okay, I'm like running too fast or I'm running too hard, I can't really say like, okay, go make that number happen, but I can tune into, okay, then I want to access my power a little bit more, or I
mm,
really need to like clean up my mechanics, or I want to focus on a particular aspect maybe that I've been working on in my training. But having a sense of what are the indicators of my physical effort, and that I use those more as the gauge for like, am I doing what I'm capable of? I don't have to necessarily look at my heart rate to
mhm.
have a sense of, does my heart rate feel really comfortable? Am I working like just above comfortable? Am I working out of my like safety zone? Um, and that again, when we practice tuning into these things in training, we're better then at referencing them in our races. But I'm going to have a much easier time, even if what I'm doing in a race is a little bit uncomfortable, but if I know that that's exactly what I'm looking for to feel,
Mhm.
like, yeah, this isn't going to be easy pace heart rate. This is going to be like, you know, a little bit higher than that. I know what my breathing and rhythm of breathing feels like when I'm working at that pace. And so then when we're using those effort-based cues, I can keep tuning into those. I can hold my focus on those and just be like, am I there? Yep, good, great. Am I there? Yep, good, great. Keep doing it. And use any of those other tools that are going to be helpful. But those are much, much, much easier to like use to regulate what we're doing. And then again, you're just like referencing. So if I'm feeling like this and I look, yep, right where I need to be. So these cues are working. So now I'm going to just keep working on feeling those.
Yeah,
That makes
I
sense?
love that. It's such a beautiful way to run and to train and race.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of athletes right now, they're going into the Chicago Marathon and flat races, as
Mm.
much as I love them and they're
Yeah.
very exciting to me, flat races can be intimidating, just like hilly races, just like any race.
We
Just
can
like any
find
race.
we can find a reason to get scared of
Yeah,
things. Sure.
exactly. What is, like, your recommendation for an athlete going into the Chicago Marathon where they know they're running 26.2 miles on a pretty flat terrain and they're worried about it getting, either too boring, um, that their body holds up? Maybe what's like a 5K chunking example that they could implement or that you could share, that could help
Yeah.
them through that?
So Chicago's a good example. I think some races are best approached when you're looking at how am I going to chunk this. We might pick a distance, so maybe a 5K, and you're just like, okay, I'm gonna 5K my way through this. Um, I tend to take a much more race specific and person specific approach to it.
Mm,
Not everybody loves a 5K as a chunk.
mhm.
Um, Sometimes that's too small. Sometimes it doesn't sort of fit well within whatever the bigger context is. So I think about it as there being a bunch of different layers of like ways that we can think about the race itself. Yes, it's 26.2. We could just break it up by I decide what these distances are. But there's also a course that's really specific. Even Boston, that's a straight line, right? A point to
Mhm.
point race. Um, it doesn't necessarily make sense to just go by 5Ks because I'll
Mhm.
tell you what, I don't care where the 5K marker is when I get to those hills. I'm thinking about the hills as the hills. And
Yeah.
like that's just a really significant part of the race. So I actually look for with each and every race just what sort of shows up from the course itself. Sometimes the elevation can give us some interesting things. I had a couple of people
Yeah.
who ran the marathon in Paris between the men and the like overnight between the Olympic
Yeah.
marathons, and that had some wild elevation, as we know if
Yeah.
we watch the Olympic marathon. And so that was a huge factor in how we organized kind of the chunks and pieces and parts of that race. Um, so for Chicago, I actually look at the course itself and how it's physically organized. The start and finish are at the same spot, but it has a pretty significant, what feels like an out and back
Mhm.
in the first like 8 or so miles of the race. There's also to the west of the start area, there's this big rectangular kind of box, like three sides of a box, and then there's the last sort of portion goes like this, very much out and back, shorter than the one up above, but this out and back that then comes to the finish. So there's sort of these 3 points where you go away from the start finish area and then kind of come back to it and go out and come back to it. And so that for me, having these physical, visible, feelable, right? You orient yourself. I'm going away. Now I'm coming back. Now I'm going this way. I made the corner. I made the corner. I made the corner. Like those kinds of things are they're landmarks, physical landmarks
Mhm.
that are, hey, on a super flat course, way more interesting to think about than just like, am I at my next 5K? Am I at my next
Yeah.
5K? So I look for things like that that create a sense of like interest, but also engagement around like I visually have a sense of where I'm at, so I can sort of see the map from above. But then while I'm in it, I'm like oriented to this space that allows me to not have to think as much about what mile am I at.
Mhm.
Because again, we go back to the start of the conversation. If someone goes through an entire marathon and never thinks about or focuses on 26.2 miles, that is absolutely wonderful in my opinion. I don't ever want someone focused on 26 miles because it's just not helpful. No one responds well when you're like, just go work hard for 26 miles. So so I look for things like that. I also, one of the layers that I look at is people's nutrition and hydration schedule. So whether that's by time or that's by distance, and sort of how that matches up with. For a lot of people who are
Mm.
fueling really well, sometimes just the like, okay, just getting to my next gel. Right? There's someone I work with who takes a gel every 3 miles, and
Yeah.
literally her race plan is 1, 2, 3 gel, 1, 2, 3 gel, 1, 2, 3 gel,
I love that.
because it works, right?
Yeah.
So we're really just looking for like what feels helpful for people. And then the final layer that I really look at is once we have some of these pieces and parts, whether it's like based on the route and the course or it's based on specific distances or times, then I look at these elements of like meaning and purpose. Sometimes I actually look at what's the story that we're going to tell through the pieces. So where do we start, and then like where do we go next, and then what's the build, and then where, and again that becomes really specific to the person. But um, you know, even though most people will warm up, well, not most people, a lot of people will warm up before a marathon. Some people are like, I'm at the start and just gonna go. But like one of my favorite things is to look at what's the portion within the marathon that even if you're running at marathon pace, you're still going to label in your own head warm up. Because
Mhm.
do you know what we do all the time? Every long run we do and every workout that we do, your coach always has something labeled warm up. And do you know what you eventually do? You just ignore the warm up. It's just like invisible miles to you. If you have a big workout, you're like, yeah, I did 2 or 3 miles as warm up, but then I did all this stuff. We stop thinking about it. So if we're going to take 26 miles and break it down and label 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, whatever
Right.
number of miles as warm up for you, you start to engage in terms of like that emotional activation. You start to engage in those miles in this bigger race with that same practiced vibe that you have. Just warm up miles. Okay. Oh, you mean I'm already at mile 6, and oh, now I'm going to do some work here. Okay, cool. But now I'm really ready for what happens next. So I look for all of those kind of different pieces and parts, and it's really like a very customized kind of process for each person. But there are many more possibilities to how we devise and create that mental race plan than simply just the like a singular distance for chunking.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so cool about it, and it's something we have, a few mutual athletes that we work with, and
Yeah.
it's so fun to have coaching calls with them and to hear feedback of their sessions with you, and one athlete in particular, she has raced quite a bit
Mhm.
working with you and hearing how each race is customized. And it's every single race is different.
Mhm.
And it's based on her, where she is in her life, in running, the course, the fueling, all the things that you mentioned.
Yep.
So it is really cool that it can be so customized down to the day for that athlete, that course. And
Right.
it's never going to be the same.
It really isn't. right?
Yeah.
Because
They aren't.
even if you're running the same, like if you're running, someone's running Chicago and they ran Chicago last year, you're not running the same marathon. Like, yes,
Right.
technically it's the Chicago Marathon, but it's a year later and
Yeah.
you're a different person and it's going to be a different day. And so let's really look at, I mean, we can certainly learn elements of a race plan that we're like, oh, I love that and I want to keep using that. That's
Yeah.
great and that's fine. But there's also an intention to this that I think is really important for people.
Mhm.
That's something that comes up in a lot of my individual conversations is, people will go out and do long runs or they'll go do workouts and either it like didn't feel good or there's some frustration or some challenge to it. And after the fact, when we're talking about it, one of my first questions is, what was your intention? Sort of, did you at all? And if you did, what were you focused on going in? Like, what were you trying? Like, what was the purpose of it? What were you telling yourself? How did you decide to break it down? And a lot of times people are like, oh, I guess well, it was just, it's on the program. So I just went to go do it, and there's almost no more intention than that. And so that's a big part of really developing the mental side of your training, is recognizing how often there is an opportunity for, and then really how to effectively, for you in each of those workouts and long runs and things like that, create the kind of intention, focus, structure, chunking, etc.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So if athletes are interested in working with you, maybe they have a fall race coming up, maybe they're looking, in 2025 to do some incredible running things,
Yeah.
where and how do they get a hold of you?
Well, people can always find me on social media. I'm Emily Saul Boston on Instagram. I don't do a ton of content posting, but it is a nice way to get connected with people. And my website, esaulmovement.com, is a great way to learn a little bit more. And people can reach out just directly by email, esaulmovement@gmail.com. And that's how I get started with people. I do consult sessions for folks who are new to it, just to have a chance to learn a little bit more about what people are experiencing and what they're looking for, and also for them to figure out if working with me feels like a good fit for them. So I like to have that opportunity to make sure that it feels good in both directions. So
Oh, good. That's great. I love that. Thank you so much for your time today, Emily. It was really great to have you and to talk through how to chunk a race. And I hope you have a great week.
thank you, Sarah. I'm so happy to be here and really excited for everyone who's out there running, training, running marathons or not.
Yeah. Woohoo.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.